Hello everyone, and welcome to our next video series covering our new unit in world literature called Europe in Transition. So this is going to take place during the 19th century of European history, and it's going to be broken down into two parts. So we're going to start with our first part called The Expressions of the Heart in our discussion of the Age of Romanticism. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with the term Romanticism, it's not only a hugely important movement within literature, but also within history itself. And it's classified first and foremost as a social and political movement. For those who are familiar with history, you'll know that we skipped over the Enlightenment. And this was a time when people were going back into basing things in logic and reason, relying more on science than emotion. And Romanticism is going to evolve in part out of a rejection of that emphasis. So looking more inwardly into the person, into emotion and deep feeling, rather than basing things simply on what we can see and what we can touch. Additionally, Romanticism as a literary movement greatly embraces ideas and discussion of nature, particularly the beauty of nature, the complexity of human emotion, and the importance of individual experience. And if we're characterizing Romanticism as a movement, one of the things that we're going to say about it is that it is formed out of this rebellious feeling and has these rebellious ideas. So in a sense, it's really a movement for the rebellious, not conforming to what was seen as a proper train of thought at the time. Additionally, one of the great outcomes of Romanticism is this idea of fighting for the rights of the common people. So we're not just concerned with logic and reason and thinking, but how do we take the nature we see around us and the complexity of human emotion and experience and use that to fight for a better life for everyone. And so additionally, in characterizing Romanticism as a rebellious movement, it also has a very revolutionary spirit. And before we dive into our literature for Romanticism, I do want to make sure everyone has at least a glimpse of the historical highlights that led to the birth of Romanticism and how Romanticism, again, is not just a literary movement, but instead it begins first as a social and political movement, and then that idea, that revolutionary spirit, is then picked up by several important literary figures that we'll discuss in our next video. So the first thing that we want to make sure we understand is that Romanticism has its initial roots in the Enlightenment. So I just told you that the Enlightenment is really this championing of science and reason. So how then does it have anything to do with Romanticism? So during the Enlightenment, which took place in the 17th and 18th century, yes, people were pushing for more study of science and reason. Additionally, this led to an idea that this power to reason and to think logically isn't just something that exists within certain people, but exists within all people. One of the great defenders of this idea is John Locke, who is famous for having this idea of everyone having the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The defense then of the dignity that exists within each and every one of us. And this idea is then continued by Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And for those of you who are familiar with French history, he is a great French philosopher who, similar to Locke, had this idea that people as individuals should be valued, that within each and every one of us is this natural goodness. And as a result then, government, so thinking back then to social and political reform, is not something that should rule over people, but instead should reflect the will of the people. And Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who I've pictured here on the right then, is going to be one of the great and early influencers of the French Revolution. So when we talk about Romanticism, yes, it is a reaction to the Enlightenment, but it takes this idea that was formed in the Enlightenment, that everyone has human dignity, and in essence, it runs with it and it enhances it. As a result, then, of these ideas that Rousseau puts forth, right, that everyone has this power to think, to reason, and that government then should not be oppressive of the people, but rather reflecting their will. We have the rise of the French Revolution. And so this really has its start on July 14th in 1789, when a group of French citizens who are angry, not just because of oppression, right? But also they're living in horrific social and economic conditions. Really, the French government at the time, the monarchy, is oppressing them greatly, and they've had enough. So they storm the Bastille, and this is the beginning of the French Revolution. And the result of this, then, is the defeat of that feudalistic system that we saw beginning in the Middle Ages, and instead is now replaced with the establishment of a republic. And a republic is simply when the government is expressing the will of the people. So they're working for them rather than working over them. Unfortunately, right, usually in history we see that good is at some point in time tainted with bad. As the French Revolution takes hold and is a great success, we also see the beginning of what's known as the Reign of Terror. And so people, rightfully so, have fought and died for the establishment of a republic, a government ruled by the will of the people. And so they begin to look around them, and anyone who they think is an enemy to this republic, who seeks to try to restore the monarchy, whether it was true of them or not, are condemned to death. And tens of thousands of people during this time period die by the guillotine. So again, this is important to reflect because although we do see huge advancements in individual freedom, we still haven't shaken off the ability, right, of people to oppress others. Moving on then, after France is firmly established as a republic, they begin a series of wars, not just to defend this republic as we saw during the Reign of Terror, but also to spread ideas that took hold in the French Revolution, this idea of people running the government. And one of the main figures who emerges through this new series of wars is Napoleon Bonaparte. And you have probably heard of him. And most of this runs around the idea of his stature, so he was known as a very short person, but also around his character, that he was very fierce in terms of leading battles, but also in his ambition. And so he ends up winning a series of wars, and he views his success and then thinks, why don't I establish myself as the Emperor of France? And this grasping for power, again, is the beginning of his downfall, because he takes this idea that France as a republic is now this brilliant model, and rather than simply giving it to the rest of Europe, he seeks to enforce it, and he really has this pursuit of power in terms of conquering all of Europe. And so he begins to do so, and Europe does not take this lying down, so they begin to fight back. And so there are two huge events, really, that mark the end for Napoleon. One is when he is finally defeated by the Belgians in the Battle of Waterloo, but also in his historically poor decision to invade Russia. So anyone who ever has any ambitions of conquering the world, historically, it is never, ever, ever a good idea to invade Russia in the winter. So it does not end well for Napoleon. However, we see that the beginning good influences of the French Revolution, aside from the sort of conquering escapade that Napoleon goes on helped to instill this idea of a fight for independence in other countries. And we see several revolutions pop up throughout Europe, and most of them are successful. Greece and Belgium are two great examples. I'm giving you a picture of the Greece fighters on your right seeking their independence. However, this was not true for everyone, right? So Russia in particular is not successful in this sense, and they continue to be ruled by a monarchy, meaning the king. But overall, these little revolutions that pop up throughout Europe are greatly important in promoting these ideas of freedom and power of the individual, right? Remembering that these are all ideas that begin with the Enlightenment, that each and every person has value and human dignity. That's then again taken by Rousseau, and that's the base, the foundation of the French Revolution that then helps to spark, because of its success, and also in part because of the crazy ambition of Napoleon, other countries to look and see that we too can fight to gain our freedom. And then finally, we're going to end these historical highlights of Romanticism with the revolution in industry. So you'll note that one of the larger sort of players in the political field of Europe I haven't mentioned yet, and that is Great Britain. And I've done so because unlike other European nations and powers, Great Britain does not experience the revolution in the same way that these other nations do. And that is in great part because the political leaders in Great Britain see what's happening all throughout Europe, and they seek to crush and repress any inkling of rebellion. So instead of having a political revolution, they have an industrial one instead. An industrial coming from the word industry, so meaning they're moving away from an economy based on agriculture and farming, but now to an economy that is based on production. And so this is really good ultimately because the establishment of the Industrial Revolution helps to improve the quality of life for some, usually for those in the middle class and then the upper class, because they are now able to produce, sell, and purchase more goods at a faster rate of time, right? Your production increases. However, it comes at a great cost. And historically, right, we know that cost is paid by the lower class, the working class. And many of the things that they struggle with include poor working conditions, child labor, and severely unhealthy living conditions. So we see the rise of the upper and middle class literally on the backs and the health, the lives of the lower class. And so this is the revolution that reformers seek to change, right? They see what's happening with the lower class. They see that it is not supporting human dignity, but rather doing quite the opposite. And so the revolution that they experience comes here. And this is going to lead to the rise of our second movement that we'll talk about once we finish Romanticism, which is realism. And one more thing to note before I move on to our last few slides, you'll see that under the historical highlights, I've included the time period, the 1600s to the 1800s, with an asterisk. So for those of you who have got your thinking caps on today, you know that the 19th century then only refers to the 1800s. So why on earth have I also included the 1600s and the 1700s? So remember, we said that Romanticism has its initial links, its foundations in the Enlightenment, which again occurs in the 1600s, and that it's really kick-started by the French Revolution, which occurs in the 1700s. So although when we begin to read literature of Romanticism, which is going to take place mostly in the 19th century, we remember, right, we shouldn't forget that Romanticism as a movement does have its historical roots in the earlier centuries, so even beginning with the 1600s. The last thing we're going to discuss then for today are the literary highlights of Romanticism. And remember, we said that Romanticism as a social and political movement highlights this idea that all humans have dignity, that there is power in the individual. And literature is going to take this idea and run with it, particularly in England, France, and Germany. And although when we begin to study how these movements emerged historically in these three different countries, and we're going to see that it's slightly different in each, that they all share certain core characteristics. For example, this idea of the complexity of human emotion, the power of imagination, that the individual has its own dignity, and also looking at nature around us and praising that. So, for example, England is going to be one of the central participators of the Romantic movement in focusing on nature. You have two beautiful and famous poets, William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge. And they're going to kickstart Romanticism in England with the publication of lyrical ballads, which is a collection of their poetry discussing the beauty and glory of nature. We're then going to turn to France and see for France, Romanticism is going to begin about a decade earlier than it does in England, in that it begins with the French Revolution, and a good example of that being Victor Hugo's Les Miserables, and how we see his discussion of human dignity in the fight for the individual. Lastly, we see Germany, and this is going to be where we really hone in and focus our discussion on Romanticism, because we're going to be reading Faust by the notable Romantic literary writer Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. Okay? You're going to notice, if you're paying attention, that the way his name is pronounced is nothing like the way it is written on the paper, so you'll get the hang of it. Additionally, when we talk about Germany, we also talk about the particular movement within Romanticism, which is Sturm und Drang, and that translates as storm and stress. And so this movement, again, focusing on the complexity of human emotion, but as we're going to see in Faust, also the use of the supernatural. That's going to be it for today's video previewing our discussion of Romanticism. So next time we're going to get into more of the characteristics of Romantic writing. We're going to look at neoclassical versus Romantic writers, so different types of characteristics that emerge in each literary movement. And we're also going to dive more in depth into the Romanticism that emerges in France and Germany and England. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.